Hey everybody, this is chapter 2 of part 1 of Bruno Rizzi's The Bureaucratization of the World. I only have access to part 1 of the book, so that's all that's going to go up on this channel, so maybe if I somehow have access in the future to more of it, I'll read it, but as of now, this is all I have. The chapter's titled In the Camp of Agramant, or Agramant. There is as much discord amongst the escapees and exiles from the Third International as there was in the camp of Agramant. Footnote. Rizzi refers repeatedly to the camp of Agramant. The allusion is to Ariosto. Agramant, sorry, I said it wrong. Agramant is how you actually say it. Commanded the army that laid siege to Charlemagne in Paris. In response to the emperor's prayer, the archangel Michael ordered discord to sow divisions among the captains of Agramant's troops. French authors thus sometimes refer to discord in the camp of Agramant to indicate disunity within a family, party, etc. End footnote. Trotsky no longer bothers to answer his far-left critics, quote, whose ear-splitting yelping, end quote, he says, quote, is no substitute for scientific analysis, end quote. Splits, expulsions, demurs, attempts to keep discussions on pre-established lines, none of this succeeds in bearing the fundamental question. The question was there all the time, even though the circle of members draw in on itself, chipping away like an axe at the trunk of the Fourth International. The comrades B and C, not identified, Trotsky replies in an article entitled, Neither a Workers' State nor a Bourgeois State. Footnote. Quotations in this chapter are from this article. B and C are James Burnham and Joseph Carter. See also the introduction to this volume. And here is Trotsky's answer. The lazy answer of a Marxist content to echo literally the thoughts of the master. Quote, the bourgeois state will be swept away by the proletarian revolution and will be replaced by the worker state. There is no middle way for history to take, end quote. It is true Marx said this. Marx made other prophecies too, which have not been realized. We do not reproach Marx for this. On the contrary, we think Marx's greatest merit is that Marx has taught us to study social facts, and Marx has furnished us with a powerful weapon for interpreting history. It seems to us that Marxists should examine contemporary events in the light of the Marxist method, but that Marxists should not limit themselves to checking whether those contemporary events can be matched with those forecast by the great thinker himself or one of his major disciples. But the latter practice has taken root. But the latter practice has taken root, and the Marxists, in making use of it, turn themselves into Jesuits who, when short of arguments, drown you with quotations from this or that saint to thwart one's argument. And if you dare to reply that even the blessed can be mistaken, the Jesuit gets angry and roundly tells you are doubting the divinity of the saints, and that it is useless to carry on with the discussion. You are no Catholic. You are one of the damned. Your soul is damned. You are devoid of grace! Exclamation point. Marx has also been in some way sanctified, and if your reasoning leads you to conclusions which are different from those of the Jew from Trier, your place is amongst the damned, even if in studying contemporary social events you use the Marxist method. Comrades B and C affirm that the USSR has ceased to be a worker state, quote, in the traditional sense, parenthesis, question mark, end parenthesis, sense given to this term by Marxism, end quote. Comrades B and C deny that it is either a bourgeois or a proletarian state, and we wonder in passing what sort of state it can be. Then these comrades admit that the rule of the proletariat, quote, is able to express itself in a number of different governmental forms, end quote, and they go on to proclaim that, quote, the concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat is not primarily an economic, but predominantly a political concept. All forms, organs, and institutions of the class rule of the proletariat are now destroyed, which is to say the class rule of the proletariat is destroyed." End quote. There is much confusion in these thoughts of Burnham and Carter, B and C, which is natural when ideas are just taking shape. Trotsky makes his position quite clear when Trotsky declares that if the dictatorship of the proletariat is a political concept, politics is but concentrated economics, and therefore, quote, "the regime which regards the expropriated and nationalized property from the imperialists as independently of political forms, the dictatorship of the proletariat," end quote. Exactly, but we would add that the bureaucracy does not represent a class that is suited to nationalized and expropriated property. Is it always possible to decide on the nature of a state without taking account of the state's political structures? Are the forms of property ownership and the relations of production immediately and completely changed when one state consolidates itself, ousting another? Is that not the task rather of the new ruling class? Did not the Third Estate in France rest for some years on a feudal economic system? During such periods, concentrated economics does not clearly represent politics, but rather is potentially concentrated in the social class which holds the levers of power, and in the program it is putting into practice. Trotsky even admits that, quote, "in the first months of Soviet rule, the proletariat reigned on the basis of a bourgeois economy," end quote. Trotsky certainly did not say this to support our argument, but cited it as an example of class conflict between political form and economic reality, in order to draw the conclusion that, quote, "the concentration of power in the hands of the bureaucracy and even the retardation of the development of the productive forces by themselves do not change the class character of the society and its state," end quote. Trotsky. It is a question of understanding to what end in Soviet Russia expropriated and nationalized property is protected from imperialism, always supposing that this imperialism is still an effective force. In our opinion, this is the main point. What demonstrates that an invader, whether imperialist or not, would transform property relations in the USSR? Even if it is true that, in the first months of the Soviet regime, the proletariat ruled over a bourgeois economic system, and that now, inversely, we have a case of class opposition between the economic system and the state, well, is that a good reason in support of the idea that the dictatorship of the proletariat is still a reality in the land of the Soviets? The contraposition has little validity. Decidedly, it is a strange way to argue. But why is the contrary argument not valid? Or rather, if there has been a worker state with a bourgeois economy, why can there not be a non-worker state with a nationalized economy? It's actually a very good question. But why is the contrary argument not valid? Or rather, if there has been a worker state with a bourgeois economy, why can there not be a non-worker state with a nationalized economy? Perhaps we do not admit this because we have never seen a phenomenon of this sort, or because Marx did not foresee it. It seems to us that our thesis is the most logical, since all the other factors which characterize the essence of the state have been overturned under Stalin. Not in the least, argues Trotsky, even the opposite serves to prove his argument. Parenthesis. Note that the second proposition should not be borne out under a regime that is aiming at socialism, whilst the first is clear and comprehensible to everybody. End parenthesis. In the early months after the October Revolution, the dictatorship of the proletariat was a fact. It was real. If we are all agreed on this point, even in the absence of nationalized property, this signifies that the dictatorship of the proletariat is essentially a question of political forms, at least during the transition between the bourgeois and socialist economy. From what we know, it would seem that the dictatorship of the proletariat is the political form of the working class during this phase of social construction. But when its specific effects cease, it is logical to suppose that the phase itself has ceased to exist. Political factors must have their place in the definition of power until that definition disappears with the realization of socialism. And just as it is true, and everybody admits it, that even with the nationalization of property, socialism in the USSR is not an accomplished fact, it seems equally clear that nationalization and a planned economy are not proof of the existence of the dictatorship of the proletariat. I'm going to repeat that just because it seems important. And just as it is true, and everybody admits it, that even with the nationalization of property, socialism in the USSR is not an accomplished fact, it seems equally clear that nationalization and a planned economy are not proof of the existence of the dictatorship of the proletariat. For that, the proletariat must also hold power to state a truism, and this condition is so important that even though we have seen a genuine dictatorship of the proletariat with a bourgeois economic system, or a third estate in control of a feudal economy, we have not yet seen the contrary case appear in history, and today's USSR is far from convincing us. It is necessarily a form of society which is neither capitalist nor socialist, with a state which is neither workers nor bourgeois. We consider, moreover, that the dictatorship of the proletariat, having achieved nationalization of property, should pursue its socialist program, but everybody, and especially Trotsky, agrees that this is not what has happened in the land of the Soviets. Which dictatorship of the proletariat are we speaking of? The one that has swollen the state to the unheard of proportions? Or the one that, having wiped out the revolutionaries, is organizing, with the help of assassins and traitors, the sabotage of the proletarian revolution worldwide? Perhaps it is one which is forever deepening the gulf between classes. Quote, the USSR does not correspond to the norms of a worker state as set forth in our program. History has confronted us with the process of a degenerating worker state, end quote, Trotsky tells us. But what remains then after this degeneration of the worker state and of the dictatorship of the proletariat? Nationalization of property and a planned economy, replies Trotsky. Very good. Quote, nationalization of property and a planned economy, end quote, replies Trotsky. Very good, but to what end? Are we moving towards the realization of socialism? Evidently not, and even Trotsky says so. Well then, if nationalization and a planned economy persist, it is because both are compatible with the regime that does hold power. In fact, the Soviet bureaucracy has no reason whatsoever to eliminate the innovations of the October Revolution, but on the contrary, it has both political and social motives for keeping them. On the political front, the Soviet bureaucracy deceives the proletariat by telling the proletariat that nationalized property belongs to them. And from a social standpoint, it must swim with the stream, that is to say, with the development of production. Even bourgeois states themselves are moving over increasingly to nationalization of property and economic planning. Bourgeois states are at the same time also undermining the sacred canon of private property, and why should they destroy the place where this has already been accomplished? There is no need to fear a reversal of nationalization in Russia. All the facts go to show that in the land of the Soviets, the bureaucracy is in effective control. It has been there so long that a clear class differentiation has been brought about. All its political and social acts are those of a ruling class, which is bent on maintaining and strengthening its power. Yet according to Trotsky, it is not, quote, scientific, end quote, to think that the Soviet bureaucracy, which monopolizes government, can represent a new class, exclamation point. Yet according to Trotsky, it is not, quote, scientific, end quote, to think that the Soviet bureaucracy, which monopolizes government, can represent a new class, exclamation point. Quote, it is not a new bourgeoisie, end quote, we are told, or, quote, it isn't yet, end quote, and therefore it is not a class, it is a, quote, corps of clerks, end quote. Even though tradition tells us that many clerks end up as masters, in the camp of Agramant, they cannot conceive of a class other than the proletariat or the bourgeoisie, even though the bourgeoisie is long dead and the proletariat is constantly flayed by a new master. In the case of the USSR, therefore, it must perforce be a simple body of clerks, almost a petty bureaucracy, which has become the lackey of world imperialism, and that includes Italian, German, and Japanese imperialism, exclamation point. We do not think that Marxism can lead to such nonsense. This simplistic approach is still a vice of the Marxists. even though their master's basic doctrine is of universal application. Marx could not have foreseen the advent of a totalitarian state, dominated first by a clique and then by a social stratum which may later assert itself as a class. But the facts are there to be studied, and ideas do not fall from the sky, and even in the camp of Agramant, these ideas come down from time to time like occasional large snowflakes, preceding the coming blizzard. Marxists who pose as orthodox cannot be content to examine the facts in a Marxist fashion. They must delve into what lies beneath. And they have concluded that those who reason as we do are seeing mirages, whilst in reality it is they who are turning the world upside down, like the earlier idealist philosophers. They serve up their knowledge on plates garnished with Marxist dialectics which we maintain should be based on the class struggle, but they, the Marxists, cannot grasp that, throughout the world, a new class is forming. In his desire to ignore the bureaucratic class in power, Trotsky has this to say in explanation of what is happening now in the land of the Soviets. Quote, "One can with full justification say that the proletariat, ruling in one backward and isolated country, still remains an oppressed class. The source of oppression is world imperialism, the mechanism of transmission of the oppression, the bureaucracy." End quote. Trotsky, with his wit and art, knows how to confer realism on the most extravagant theories, and a casual observer is easily fascinated by the beauty of the exposition. Be that as it may, we are not moved, for the fact is that, if the international proletariat had defeated imperialism, emerging crime-laden from the bloodbath of 1914 to 1918, we would now have a world Soviet republic developing in a socialist direction. Up to a certain point, we, too, can agree that the origin of the oppression lies in imperialism, but the more important question is to determine whether Soviet bureaucracy is or is not something more than the transmission belt. The USSR, besieged by capitalism, has sunk ever deeper into degeneration, while the mechanism of this process has crystallized Soviet bureaucracy. What is the social result of this retreat? Could it not be that the, quote, transmission belt, end quote, has become all-powerful? Could it not be that that proletarian power has gone out of the window, yielding place to a so-called agency of imperialism? One can still imagine that this lackey of a supposed imperialism is defending the conquests of the October Revolution. Can one still imagine that this lackey of a supposed imperialism is defending the conquest of the October Revolution? On the contrary, we think the lackey would obey his new master and accord third-class burial to the revolutionary gains. In fact, we see him emptying the Soviets of their class content, managing the proletariat, physically destroying Marxists, and finally distinguishing between imperialisms only to go to the side of the oldest and strongest amongst them. We see him in the international arena play the part attributed to him, not in order to bring back capitalism at home, but in return for the protection he receives from the system of slavery he has set up. If he turns patriot and warmonger, it is only in order to maintain things as they are. Trotsky does not deny these facts, but Trotsky adds that the Soviet system maintains nationalized property and defends it. Quote, "So long as the contradiction is not passed from the sphere of distribution into the sphere of production, the USSR remains a workers' state." End quote. Trotsky, like all Marxists, cannot imagine a society that is neither bourgeois nor socialist. A new social structure with production organized on the basis of nationalized property and with the economy planned can only in essence be proletarian, even if the directives covering distribution are anti-socialist. As far as we are concerned, the proletariat in Russia, after a short period in power, merely changed masters. Today's bureaucratic state retains the forms of collective property and of a planned economy because these forms are in harmony with its character, just as the Roman Empire absorbed the Christian religion with its one and only God in place of its numerous pagan gods, because that was what suited it. These new economic forms are springing up everywhere, especially in weak capitalist countries which are less resistant to the disappearance of capitalism. And if capitalism has finished playing its historic role, and the proletarian revolution is not yet victorious, the world will just have to continue to develop any new social pattern, whether or not Marx foretold the pattern, and whether the Marxists have noticed it or not. The quote, clerks, end quote, which according to Trotsky are but the transmission belt of imperialism, have been in power in Russia for more than 20 years, and rule over a country which is a sixth continent and has a population of 180 million. Evidently, the quote, corpse of clerks, end quote, why did I say that? The core. Have I been saying corpse the whole time? Jesus Christ. The quote, core of clerks, end quote. God, that's embarrassing. I don't know, maybe I didn't say corpse of clerks, I don't know. The quote, clerks, end quote, which according to Trotsky are but the transmission belt of imperialism, have been in power in Russia for more than 20 years and rule over a country which is a sixth continent and has a population of 180 million. Evidently, the quote, core of clerks, end quote, is of enormous proportions, outnumbering by far its own ranks. Outnumbering by far its own masters. Rule of this kind requires a staff which at the national level represents a class in our view. To strengthen its hold, this class extends its mastery into every area of society, and wherever it meets resistance, it climbs over mountains of corpses in order to reach its goal. The bureaucracy in the USSR first got rid of the Communist Party and the Third International, and later even the Red Army. Tasks of this magnitude cannot be carried out by, quote, cliques, or, quote, staffs, or by, quote, core of clerks, end quote, but only by classes. What's going on here? It's the end of Chapter 2 of The Bureaucratization of the World, Part 1, by Bruno Rizzi.